Can you hear me over there? Good evening, everybody. Before we kick off, I'd like to announce that the presentations are going to be in Hebrew for a change, it being the Hebrew University, and anyone who needs interpretation who doesn't yet have headphones for the simultaneous interpretation is asked to just pop outside and get a pair of headphones. I think everyone is without. I see everyone's. Okay, no, not working?
It's working.
It's working?
The Hebrew is not working.
Oh, you mean you can hear the English, you can't hear the Hebrew? Never mind, listen to the English. You can't hear me directly? No? I hope that the evening will not be as muted as my voice is muffled. Is there nothing to be done? This technical problem? How about now? Well, of course I'll speak into the loudspeaker, says the speaker. We'll trust you'll speak into the microphone. I mean, it was all working fine when Hagar and I did it too. So, as I was saying, good evening, everybody. We're going to kick off our evening between Berlin and Jerusalem, Jewish problems, German problems. And perhaps we'll just wait for everyone to sit down. Okay, the order of play will be as follows. We'll listen to the three lecturers after I present each or introduce each of them, and then the questions will be at the end. So please, I'd ask everyone to make a major effort to contain themselves and wait for about an hour and a half till all the presentations have been given, and then we'll have a short discussion here. Obviously it depends on the reactions, quite how short or otherwise it will be. As for Berlin, everyone has their own memories. There are people here where I've heard already at the reception people saying that they're still from Berlin, or they lived in Berlin many, many years ago. My memories of Berlin, well, I don't want to go on this because I know on about this people don't like the chair to speak a great deal, but I have all sorts of memories from all sorts of visits from before the wall fell and after the wall fell, and I won't go on about this, but I would say that my last visit to Berlin, which was 2 years ago, in spring of 2002, when I was a visiting professor at the University of Bonn, and I had the opportunity to travel to Berlin, and I turned out there when there were the post-Jenin demonstrations going on, and I must say that this I just haven't been able to forget what I saw there since then. Every time we referred to Berlin, it was really like there were thousands of demonstrators demonstrating against the state of Israel with all sorts of horrible slogans, and really this aroused all sorts of memories, because my wife's family came from not very far from there. There was this public space with these thousands of demonstrators, and most of them, as far as I could see, were Muslims living in Germany. So this spectacle and this public space in Germany, in which my wife's family had been expelled, and then were shouting slogans against Israel, that was really a very difficult experience. I'm sure you will hear all sorts of things, far more specific and far more academic, from the speakers. The first speaker is Angelika Timm. She is now a visiting scholar at the University of Bar-Ilan. She's been doing this for a number of years. Angelika Timm is, I should imagine, known to a goodly proportion of the people here. First of all, because of her lectures at the various Israeli universities, Haifa, Jerusalem, and now Bar-Ilan, and also her numerous publications, and I must say I have read some of her very interesting publications about German-Israeli relations. I won't obviously give you the entire list of Professor Timm's publications, but I will just give you a brief review for those of you who would like to read a little bit later. Israel Gesellschaft in Wandel, that's a book which came out in 2003, and Israel Geschichte des Staates seit seiner Gründung came out in 1980 in Bonn. Jewish Claims Against East Germany, Moral Obligations and Pragmatic Policy. That was published by the Central European Press. 27, and all sorts of other books. Angelika is a very productive academic, so I now give her the floor, and I think it's a great privilege to hear her this evening. Angelika, I'll try. Good evening. The title of our symposium is Between Berlin and Jerusalem, Jewish Problems, German Problems. Well, I am a German, I'm a Berliner, and I have been teaching in Israel for 2.5 years now, and I was really very, very happy to be invited, and I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. In the Israeli press, recently, a number of articles have appeared about growing anti-Semitism in Germany. I remember there was one article that was published in Yediot Ahronot under the title, "In Germany They Hate Jews Again," about anti-Jewish demonstrations and desecration of a German cemetery in Bochum, a West German town. And I remember an interview with the leader of the NPD, the neo-Nazi party, saying that Hitler really was a great leader. Now, I understand in particular, because I live here, I've been living here for the last 2.5 years, that these articles are a real challenge to the Israeli public. Now, it's true that in 2003 there were more than 1,300 anti-Semitic events. A little less than in 2002, but more than in 1999, when there were only 817 anti-Semitic incidents. In April 2004, a poll shows that a large proportion of the Germans have anti-Semitic opinions, or at least opinions which show that they don't like Jews. These facts are also known in Germany. The Bundestag in December 2003 unanimously passed, and I think it's very important to stress the fact that it unanimously passed a resolution condemning anti-Semitic manifestations in the Bundestag. It's also going to have a debate about this topic this year, or rather it had one in 2004. Let me quote Joschka Fischer, the German foreign minister. He said, "Our historical and moral responsibility for the Shoah means above all that we have to resolutely counter all forms of anti-Semitism, all forms of racism and xenophobia. We must not evade this responsibility, and our vigilance must never wane." I should imagine most people here know that in May 2005, the National Monument, Holocaust Monument, will be dedicated in Berlin. So the question is there a contradiction between public pronouncement and what is happening on a grassroots level? In order to respond to this question, or to try to provide an answer, I want to start by focusing on the question of what are the dominant trends in Germany's political culture, particularly with regard to the Nazi past. Anyone who today follows what's going on in Germany will be fully aware that the center of public debate today is constituted by, I would say, the government's policy to carry out a new economic reform involving dramatic cutbacks in unemployment benefits, changes in the state health system, and so on. With higher unemployment and lower social benefits, millions of people have been adversely affected, and this has become the number one topic. I think here, too, in September, October, one should remember that there were a number of anti-government demonstrations in Germany. They started in East Germany and then they spread to West Germany as well. And I don't think we can ignore the fact that the economic situation, particularly everything linked to these reforms, constitute the number one topic. But of course there are other issues as well. In May 2005, in Germany, they will be marking the 60th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. And this will obviously spark a public debate on German guilt and the responsibility of the future generations. Inter alia in Germany today, they're asking whether the Germans were only murderers or perhaps they were victims as well. Bookshops contain many books about the Second World War, about politicians and military personnel from that period. And millions of Germans saw the film Der Untergang, which showed Hitler's last days, and quite a few claim that today it is possible to do what wasn't possible before, which is to understand the considerations that underlay Hitler's actions. I will try and speak up. Now, you're going to have to deal with that cough, my darling. I went off these frogs. Oh, God, this awful audio thing. Is that better? Okay, I do apologize. Today, in the public, first and foremost, people remember the German civilian victims, like the victims of the Anglo-American bombings, women who were raped by Soviet soldiers, the victims of Wilhelm Gustav, the ship that was bombed by the Red Army. I should imagine that some of you are familiar with Gunter Kreis's book. And I should imagine that you understand, therefore, that there are some trends underway, which I would call new ones, which were not present in the public debate a few years ago. I would say that since 1990 there's been a tendency to remember all of the victims of all dictatorships, not just the Jewish victims of the concentration camps. There's the Poles, the French, and so on, who were murdered by German soldiers as well. You have to be remembered. So the question is whether and to what extent the Germans' concentration on their own suffering leads to relativization of German guilt, or whether we should consider these tendencies as more realistic ones than the propensities of the past. It's a fact that memory frequently relates to self-pity on the part of the Germans and discussions with regard to German patriotism. If you look at German texts. The two major parties also are talking more about German patriotism. The Chancellor, the Chancellor, for example, has said that companies which are leaving Germany are not sufficiently patriotic, and the concept German culture is become a leading one. Deutsche Leitkultur, I don't know whether I can translate that properly, a leading German culture. That term is now politically correct, although a few years ago it at that time gave rise to controversy in all of the press to talk about Leitkultur, German Leitkultur. So that means a certain taboo has been smashed with regard to tackling the issue of the Third Reich. Discussion about Leitkultur also ties up to attitude to foreigners and migrant workers living in Germany. I'd like to remind you that today there are something like 7 million foreigners resident out of 82 million Germans. That's not a particularly high percentage, but it's not such a small percentage either. Recently, let's say in the last few years, there's been much talk about a multicultural society. I remember Chancellor Kohl, particularly after reunification, talking about a European Germany, that we really wanted a European Germany and not a German Europe. And the goal was more or less to establish a multicultural society. There's less talk of this today. There's more reference to the failure of the multicultural society. This did not start only after Van Gogh, the Dutch film producer, was assassinated. Throughout Europe, people are asking themselves whether it's really possible to have a multicultural society. I think in Germany, though, this started earlier, and it goes back to the early 90s. From 2004 to 2004, the percentage of Germans went up who thought that the slogan "Germany for the Germans" was right. The percentage went up from 28 to 38, and now 36% of Germans say that in their country people relate with some mistrust to Muslims. And I do believe that if we are referring to how people relate to Muslims, not only in Germany, this is an attitude that applies to other European countries as well, particularly after 9/11. There really are many discussions about how Muslims are treated, how they are to be treated. There are many attitudes, there's a lot of negativism, and obviously I don't want to ignore that. Xenophobia, Islamophobia, incitement against foreigners today are more frequent than previously, certainly than 10 years ago, let's say. In today's Germany, I see two tendencies in the political culture, which are relatively new ones. The breaking of the taboos with regard to the Third Reich, and secondly, the Islamophobia and xenophobia. And these are attitudes which underlie and reinforce anti-Semitism. The American Jewish Committee 2004 survey concludes that about 1/3 of Germans have anti-Semitic attitudes. I am not going to rely solely on surveys, but we must also take account of the fact that the Federal Interior Ministry refers to more marked tendencies towards anti-foreign incitement, anti-Semitism and so on, and the Interior Ministry relates the anti-Semitic tendencies to the far-right tendencies as well. I think the chairman's mic's still on, and that's her problem, because I just heard him cough. In the right-wing parties, and recently we've seen two right-wing parties coming into the Saxony and the Brandenburg assemblies, there certainly are anti-Semitic tendencies there, and anti-Semitism certainly is an important part of their ideology. But we must also take account of the fact, go and get yourself a hot drink, they'll still have hot water downstairs. This is not an exclusive phenomenon, but think of the scandal with Hohmann, the CDU parliamentary representative, who declared publicly that what was done by the offences committed by the Jews in the Communist Party and the Nazis in the Second World War, there was no difference between those. And there was a letter provided by a high-ranking military official who said that Hohmann had expressed the feelings of many Germans. So we have to realize that we mustn't just talk about the far right. These sentiments are present elsewhere as well. Now, part of the situation we must remember is that Hohmann was kicked out of the assembly and his party, and the high-ranking military official was also removed from the army. I think it's absolutely right. No, let me put it this way. Yediot Ahronot wrote, I think not rightly, that anti-Semitism has become something that almost goes without saying. That's not true, because the general certainly wasn't speaking on behalf of the majority of Germans. I think, however, we must take both sides of the coin into account, but one cannot ignore the fact that worries me as well, which is that according to a poll that has been carried out in the wake of this episode, 40% of West Germans and 28% of East Germans did support Hohmann's statements. Again, however, at the same time, there are many initiatives that are directed against the far right in all kinds of states. Civil society in Germany does not accept these views, but they do exist and they are becoming more marked. Coming now to Germany's attitude to the Holocaust, here too I see two tendencies. One is that that the government is shouldering responsibility for the Holocaust and is coming out strongly against anti-Holocaust statements. Not only things such as that I quoted you before by Foreign Minister Fischer, but all sorts of concrete measures. However, as I've said, there is this process of a reaffirmation of the German self-image. This is a fairly marked tendency, but I wouldn't say this is entirely a new phenomenon in Germany either. I would just like to remind you of the 1986 historians' debate, the controversy over the Holocaust monument in Berlin. It took more than 10 years before the Bundestag really took a decision to build this monument, this memorial. The discussion about the memorial today also ties up with discussions not only with the discussion about the Holocaust memorial, but also it ties up with the idea of, or with what should be done with regard to the Germans who were expelled from Czechoslovakia in particular as a result of the Potsdam conference decisions. I'd remind you of what Martin Walser wrote. He said that he couldn't take any more about the Holocaust, any more films and so on. He said that there was being exploitation made of the Holocaust for inappropriate ends. The Jews in Germany are particularly worried, and they're following what's happening in Germany. I do think that both the government and the politicians are fully aware of what's going on. And I'd like again to quote the foreign minister who said, "Something seems to have changed in Germany, and nobody feels it more directly and distressingly than the German Jews. They feel abandoned once again, and that we cannot allow, not in Germany." Frequently, the question arises whether there are differences between the east of Germany and the west of Germany. I don't have enough time to go into details here, but all surveys show, with regard to anti-Semitic tendencies from 1990 to today, that anti-Semitic tendencies in the East are less marked than in the West, but incitement against foreigners, xenophobia, are far more marked in the East, more aggressive even. For example, just two examples. For example, in 1990, 56% of West Germans and 40% or just 44% of East Germans thought that the time had come to put an end to dealing with the Holocaust, addressing the Holocaust. With regard to xenophobia, in 2001, there was a poll carried out by the American Jewish Committee, AJC, and that showed that 10% of West Germans, but 16% of East Germans, and in 2002, 20 and 30% of West and East Germans respectively hated foreigners and thought that Germany should be for the Germans. And recently, in fact, we have seen that the right-wing parties have harvested many, many votes in the East specifically. It would be very interesting to reply to the question as to the reasons for these results, but lack of time precludes me from being able to do this, and I'll leave it for the discussion. I think that if we are talking about anti-Semitism and these tendencies, we cannot afford to ignore the position of Israel in current affairs discussions. In this respect, I don't want to go into details. I'm sure that we will hear details from David Witzthum about this, but Israel's image plays an important role in the political culture of Germany, on the TV news. First of all, you have a report about what's going on in the area. Israel, through the mirror of the conflict, and when I give lectures on Israel in Germany, very often I hear questions that relate almost exclusively to the conflict. I don't think people know enough about the actual realities of life in Israel. cliches and stereotypes are absolutely dominant in the public discussion, and I think the media play an important role, or bear an important role in overcoming these prejudices and stereotypes, and they shouldn't reinforce them. In 2002, for example, we've seen that there have been politicians who have taken advantage of the conflict in the electoral campaign. Remember Jürgen Mellermann from the Liberal Party, the FDP, but I do believe that there are others as well who also tried to exploit this state of affairs. How much longer do I have? I have a few more minutes? Okay. In this connection also, I do believe it's important for us to see both sides of the coin. On the one hand, with regard to Israel as well, there are a variety of expressions with regard to the far or the extreme right. Anyone who is an anti-Semite, it said, will be anti-Israeli as well. And in the extreme right party, certainly there are many, many expressions of an anti-Israeli nature. On the other hand, there's more and more talk of Muslim anti-Semitism. There is a strong group of Muslims in Germany, and their statements are increasingly related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think there's a totally different background to this than to the Germans who express a variety of opinions. In addition to this, I would say there's also a mainstream, major group which is worried by what's going on here, and they express criticism of Israel on those grounds. Sometimes I would say there are indeed people who've had their prejudices. They may have anti-Semitic views as well, but I do not hold that everyone who expresses criticism of Israeli policy really is anti-Semitic. I would say, therefore, that we must make a distinction between a number of different views and tendencies. I'd like to conclude with a number of questions that bother me. First of all, where does Germany stand compared with other European countries with regard to anti-Semitic tendencies? I think this is important. We can't just talk about Germany. Germany today is really part of the European Union and must be considered as such, but Germany is Germany, and Germany has a past, and we have to take that into account. As a result, it's not particularly easy to make such a comparison between Germany and other European countries. Secondly, what must we do in order to effectively combat anti-Semitism? It's clear, and I think there is indeed a consensus in the German public, other than the extreme right, of course, that it is necessary to combat anti-Semitism, that anti-Semitism cannot be tolerated, but there are no plans which are really effective ones. What the government says is very important, but that's on the one hand. On the other hand, the question is what can really be done. Thirdly, when is criticism of Israel and the Israeli government and government policy anti-Semitic, or even if we say that not all criticism is anti-Semitic, the question is, doesn't every item of criticism reinforce anti-Semitism? And then fourthly, what can we do with regard to Islamic or Muslim anti-Semitic, or if we take Islamophobia, does Islamophobia actually drive such an attitude. So, let me now summarize by saying, if we analyze the current situation in Germany, then we must conclude that there are all kinds of trends, sometimes conflicting ones, and it's necessary to take account of a number of different aspects. On the one hand, there are marked trends or tendencies towards putting an end to addressing the Nazi past and put the feelings of Germans in the center. This tendency has been taken advantage of by certain anti-Semites, and they, on the strength of this, won a lot of votes in the last elections. On the other hand, there's a very critical public which doesn't accept these facts, not only politicians, and I've quoted Joschka Fischer, but there are many other expressions along these lines as well, not just from politicians, people who reject right-wing extremism and anti-Semitism. But civil society is also adamantly against such tendencies. There are new initiatives, specifically in the new states where the neo-Nazis have entered parliament. So public debate in Germany shows that it's impossible to forget the Nazi past and the Holocaust. And I think this is a very important thing. If we analyze the dominant trends, we must take these into account as well. 60 years after the end of World War II, Germany cannot allow itself to switch to a new agenda, and I think that's a major difference if we compare it with the other European countries. Germany is Germany. The fact that in France, in the US, in Belgium, and in other countries, anti-Semitism also exists does not reduce the specific responsibility of Germany. And I wish to emphasize this once again. At the beginning, I said that it seems to me that a certain taboo has been broken. I don't want to have tabooization. I don't think it helps to insist on taboos. No, I really do think we should break taboos on the one hand. Well, at least we should speak openly about what's going on. But at one and the same time, we must reinforce democratic forces. We must strengthen groups, people's opinions which oppose such tendencies. And here too, I would say, and this brings me back to what it says in Yediot Achonot, it's not enough to speak in cliches and in generalizations. I think what's really important is to disseminate a balanced picture of Israel. And I would say in Germany too, it's very important that we put over balanced picture, proper picture of what's going on in Israel, and vice versa of what's going on in Germany. There are various diverse trends, and we have to take account of most, or at least, let's just say, all of these tendencies. The most important thing, in my opinion, is the public discussion. In other words, the recruiting, if you like, of a democratic society. That means education at schools, that includes the media, that includes discussions in the state parliaments and so on. In other words, again, not tabooization, but a public, active discussion and debate. That's what we need in Germany. This does exist, but...
Thank you, Professor Angelika Timm, for your presentation. I trust there will be many questions relating to the breaking of the taboo, which causes what I call a contamination of the collective memory. Movies such as Untergang, The Downfall, books, etc. But we'll have the questions later on, and I'd like now to commend you again for your wonderful Hebrew, for having made such a long presentation in Hebrew. I'm not sure I could have done that in German. I forgot to ask your forgiveness for my German accent, says Angelika Timm. No, it was really extraordinary. And we are now going over to the next speaker, who is David Witzthum. I trust that you all know him. Dudu and I have studied cello, to play the cello with the same teacher, so we have known each other for many, many years. You all know him as a journalist in the Israeli television Channel 1 and a presenter of the very popular night news show. And Dudu has always been a scholar and an excellent musician, but he doesn't play cello as well as I do. He's a fantastic musician, a great scholar, and he wrote many articles. I'll mention just a few. There's a very long list. The German New Ride in Europe, which was published in Zmanim, in the magazine. The Holocaust and Today's Extremism in 1993, the Israeli media in Germany, etc., etc., etc. And I invite him to take the floor and give it. Thank you very much. Good evening. About a month ago, I returned from a conference which was held at a place to which I have an indirect connection. It was in a castle in the south of Germany called Emau. And I trust that some of you have been there in that castle. I knew that castle. I wasn't aware that I knew the place, but I did know the place because my most favorite book when I was a child was The Flying Class by Erich Kästner. And if you remember the book, Erich Kästner says that he wanted to write a book about a high school in Kirchberg in Christmas, but in August in Berlin. It is rather difficult to write such a story. And so his mother took him to the railway station and bought him a ticket to a field which overlooks the Zugspitze. And there, with a calf named Absalom and a butterfly, he wrote the story, and that is where the castle stands, and that's how I am connected to it. And there was a conference about a Tarbut Tagung, culture Tagung. There were about 300 to 400 Jews, German Jews, including a few Austrian Jews, Swiss Jews, and some visitors from some other countries in Europe, and I wanted to integrate my impressions of that conference in what I'm going to talk to you about in today's conference between Berlin and Jerusalem. And this name reminds me, of course, of Gershom Scholem's book. And Gershom Scholem in the 60s already, if you remember, wrote an article under the title of Between Jews and Germans, in which he delved into the relations between the two countries, which had undertaken a pragmatic character at that time. It was at the time of the institution of diplomatic connections between Israel and Germany, and the connections between the two peoples. And he said that there was an abyss between the two peoples, an abyss that require a very long time in order to gap it, to bridge it. And I would like to add to these two levels the third level, which is the level that has to do with culture, or the extra-statal relations, or rather the relations between the peoples that we are talking about. And hence I'd like to speak about the Jews in Germany, and to relate to the Jews in Germany through the perspective of that particular conference. So, in contrast to the complex relationship between Washington and Jerusalem and the role of American Jews, Jews in Germany play a problematic role, which is not fully expressed in Israeli media. Israeli media, like the media in most of the world, is busy with itself, with its own country, and Only when there is a very extraordinary event, we tend to look further. And in Germany, there was no extraordinary event which relates to us since 92, 93. Those events that had to do with the fall of the wall, the unification, the Gulf War, the great outbursts of the neo-Nazis in 92 and 93. And ever since, we have been engaged preoccupied with ourselves, and we have left Berlin to Germany. And hence I would say today that between Berlin and Jerusalem, beyond the interstatal strong relations, which have their own problems, there is no real bridge, and the relations between Israel and Europe have turned into something which is very fragmented. Our look towards Europe is fragmented. There is the political Europe, there is Europe of football and basketball. Excuse me, but I'm replacing Moshe Zimmerman here. So there's football and basketball, and there's the league that we would like to belong to. There's colonial Europe, there's Mediterranean Europe, there's Central Europe, the ancient Jewish Europe. But we do not have a concept within the media world of Europe. And certainly, most certainly, we do not have a concept of Jews in Europe, let alone German Jews. The Jews, for us in Israel, mostly on television and in the press, fulfill a very passive role, quite often touching on a lack of patience. Or if you remember Ezer Weizmann, the president, who used to say that he doesn't understand at all what Jews have to look for in Germany, which is the country of the Nazis. And Weizmann, like Begin before him in the dispute or discussion with Helmut Schmidt, had the talent of giving expression to the gut feeling of most people. I had a poll or a questionnaire between all the journalists of Channel 1 in '98 for some research that I was conducting in that framework. And I'm talking about 30-odd journalists, and it was a very simple poll which had been held in other countries as well, and it involved two questions. The first one was that when I tell you the word Germany, what comes to mind, to your mind? The second question was, and what is your second thought after that? So the first thought that came to mind, 100% of the people questioned, 100%, with no exception, answered that they think about Nazis or the Holocaust. There was not one single one who dared think otherwise. Kind of daring. In Great Britain it was 80%, in Poland it was 90%, in Holland the percentage is slightly lower, but the trend is quite clear. The way people look at Germany is very particular. So all our perspective, when you talk about Jews in Germany, the perspective becomes completely skewed. And so this is what happened. And in spite of that, when we speak about Germany and the Jews in Germany, we cannot speak about a small community any longer, or the community that we had before the 90s. Nowadays, we have an entirely different kind of community. I'd like to give you just a few figures, even though the figures are not fully accurate. There are several criteria and parameters according to different interests. Last year, for the first time, more Jews arrived from the former Soviet Union to Germany than to Israel. And 19,000 arrived to Germany and 18,000 to Israel. So this is the beginning of a trend or a tendency which may come to a halt. But this increased ever since the decision of the prime ministers of the various landers in Germany to allow coming of Jews from the former Soviet Union, or Jews or partly Jews or had met Jews, lived among Jews, to come to Germany. In 2003, some 15,000 came, and if the law is not going to change, but it looks like it is going to change, this year they expect some 27,000 Jews. To date, about 190 to 200,000 people have arrived from the former Soviet Union. In the Jewish communities, there are slightly more than 100,000 registered. So many of these Jews do not even register in the Jewish communities. Officially, about 83,000 Russian Jews or formerly Russian Jews joined the communities. By the way, there were 13,000 registered and another 83,000 were added. Their situation is not a brilliant one. In Berlin, for instance, they have 12,000 registered. Only 2 are paying their community dues. About 80% are jobless or unemployed, so the community is suffering from a great deficit, and the same applies to many other communities. There's several, about 50,000 people who came in Israel. They also evaluated some 50,000 people at least who came from the former Soviet Union to Germany. The new arrangement, which is about to be applied in January with the support of Israel, immigration will be allowed only to people under 45 who do not require social welfare, with at least one parent, undoubtedly a Jew, and having been formally invited by one of the Jewish communities in Germany. This is a new arrangement, and Teoshilio, the Minister of the Interior, said that this is going to be done in coordination with the Jewish community and the Jewish community heads. But there are very heated discussions in the communities. Of course, one interest is to increase the number of Jews in the community. The greater the number of people, the more funds they receive from the state. But even the welfare of these Jews is also a burden on the shoulders of the community. And so the Israeli position, of course, is that these Jews should come to Israel. The German Jews say, no, why? Maybe they won't come to Israel, they won't come here. Maybe they will remain in Russia. If they are rejected from here, it does not necessarily imply that they will come to you, to Israel. So, in this conference that I was relating to, many of the problems were described. The first one was the issue of the integration of those Jews from the former Soviet Union. The people complain that they don't speak the language, they don't speak German, they do not integrate, they bring a new, different Russian awareness or perception of Germany, and they have even the hold conferences of the veterans of the Red Army with veterans of the Wehrmacht. For them, Germany is merely a country of refuge, and the discourse on the Jewish issues and the Holocaust, which was very strong in the 70s and the 80s, and there was still the mythical figure of Galinsky, Hans Galinsky, who was the head of the community. All this seems to be evaporating, but not only among there are differences not only among German Jews and formerly Soviet Jews. There is the Chabad. Chabad is the name of the new enemy of the Jewish German community, because the Chabadniks are bringing their own contents and values. They have their own activities. They try to have people turn back to religion, to lay tefillin, and this, of course, is seen with great criticism by the German Jews. But there are other communities as well. There are communities of Reform Jews, of communists, of Jews who are almost half Christians, who hold a constant discourse, an interesting discourse, but very problematic one, with the evangelical church, and not only the institutional one, but even fundamental evangelical churches. There are even evangelical Jews, so to speak. So there are other communities that have a greater attraction to these newcomers than the conservative Jewish communities. I remember calling the Jewish community in Bamberg, and Doron and I are very familiar with the Bamberg because of its Philharmonic orchestra. They even have a viola player who's a Jew. And so I called the community and I said, hello. And somebody asked me, do you speak Russian? In the Jewish community in Bamberg, nobody speaks German. They asked me if I speak Russian. And there are other problems that we'll get into that Angelika is very well familiar with, of the Jewish communities in Eastern Germany, where real criminals have taken over the communities in order to lay their hands on public assets, real estate assets, and this happened in the first years after the unification. At Elmau, there was a very interesting debate which evolved between Shimon Stein, the Israeli ambassador and Der Spiegel. The main idea was, should the German Jewish community stand at Israel's side in every issue that is between Israel and Germany? And second, the Zentralrat demanded to take positive action for Israel, even to establish a lobby like AIPAC in the States. Spiegel answered almost angrily that Jews do support Israel, but not in every condition, and they do not automatically support every single step of the Israeli government, and he cannot even envisage the establishment of such an organization, and he was really applauded. There is no chance to establish an equivalent to AIPAC in Germany. They also claim that there are friendship associations of Germans and Jews in Germany who support Israel, but not blindly. And more than the speakers dared to say openly, the anti-Israel spirit which prevails in Europe today and in Germany is so strong that the Jews, especially those more salient figures, the community leaders, etc., are afraid of identifying openly with Israel, with Jerusalem, and with Sharon, because they fear that in so doing they will lose their legitimacy in the public debate in Germany. So if you say in Germany that you identify with Sharon, in Israel too, it's rather complex to say that you identify with Sharon. Not too many people would say that in an assertive manner. But if they say so, they will lose their legitimacy in public debate, and this can be felt in universities, in debates in universities, with the church, the media. There is no willingness at all to listen to the official Israeli stand. Today, perhaps a tiny little bit more after the approval of the disengagement plan, but the Israeli right is not invited, which is because it is looked upon as something similar to apartheid in Germany. In the lesser case, and in the worst case, they are compared to the Nazis. And people who were a little bit more critical of Sharon, for them Sharon is a symbol, symbolizing a leader who is to be ostracized. Never mind his present deeds, and the agreement on such an axiom seems to be a condition sine qua non for someone to participate in a public debate, and the community is too weak to stand against such approach, especially with strong support to the Palestinian cause. I gave you the example of the referendum of the Evangelical Church to Israel. One of the ideas which they brought up was to send young volunteers to demonstrate together with the anarchists against the police on the wall, on the fence, to infiltrate into Israel, so to speak, as volunteers, and to join these. But so far, this idea has failed. An interesting issue, an interesting question is the way intellectual Jews who participate in the public debate go over or embrace the general European criticism of Muslim fundamentalism. All the organizations I'm familiar with, who in the past expressed radical leftist ideas, today are shying away from these positions. So I'll give you an example. Henrik Broder, a well-known personality in Germany, has come here many times, and he claims, and I'm quoting, that the European countries have began a process, or historic process, of saying goodbye to the state of Israel, saying farewell. Another example, one of the defenders of Theo van Gogh, an anti-Islamist, blames the German media of inflaming the public debate. Salamander, Dadiner, Josef Jofe, in the Zeit, Jack Schuster and Die Welt, Doron Mendels in Austria. And he speaks about the Austrian discourse, somewhat different from the German one, and he he says that in Germany there is a pessimism concerning the future. In Austria there is optimism concerning the past. That's a very interesting quotation. And other philosophers such as Alain Finkielkraut and Bernard-Henri Lévy in France express themselves in similar manners. And Michael Wolfson, who lectures in the German Army University, has become ostracized after he said in an interview that one ought to consider physical pressure, exertion of physical pressure in interrogating terrorists. So all these organizations are now embracing a different line, a different policy. Someone like Hermann Grablitze, who is the editor of the well-known magazine Konkret, which is a radical communist, extremist magazine, he is today defending the Israeli position together with an organization in Germany called Anti-Deutsch. They all work with cellular telephones, and they organize cat demonstrations. Whenever there's something anti-Israel, they appear very quickly with Israeli flags, etc. It's an amazing story, but you ought to be made aware of it. Now, those Jews who were there at Elmau, the issue was, is anti-Semitism, is that the central focal point which from now on will define the contents and the identity of Jews in Germany? Is this the main issue? It's quite clear to the Jews that assimilation in the same sense as before the war is not an option. There is no such assimilation anymore. And in some cases people attested to that. I had a conversation with some of the people that I mentioned here, and they told me something very firm off the record. I won't give you the name, but three of the main personalities said, we, Israel and the Jews, are leading here a losing battle. We have lost the battle in Germany, and the Jews in Germany have been removed or pushed out of the public discourse. Looking at these pictures, and Schupps said, I sat there, I saw the euphoria on television, and I thought to myself, this really doesn't touch me. This has nothing to do with me. And then somebody reacted in the audience. I have a story about a Jew in Berlin whose wife calls him and says to him, come and see in the window, there's a beautiful weather outside. And he says, what does it have to do with me? This is their weather, not mine. And I thought to myself then, I thought about the difference between this Schubsen outlook on what happened in Berlin and ours. You certainly remember this euphoria that was even here in Israel, which prevailed even here when we were witnessing what was happening in Germany. This event in Berlin has modified many perceptions which prevailed in Israeli society vis-à-vis Germany. And now one of the most important protagonists sits there a few meters away and says, it doesn't touch me at all. It has no bearing on me. And this, of course, is a sort of self-defense mechanism, an extremely strong one. Now, the issue of European identity, that too is a sort of a closed option. Europe has been defining itself in distancing itself from the United States and President Bush as well. Alain Finkielkraut, in a thought-provoking book, defined the new anti-Semitism as a global one, which reminds to the Jews the dark times of history. I suppose, Robert, that we will talk about Finkielkraut later on. No, you can carry on. The Jews appear in his mind, in his view of things, like ghosts from the past who disturb the Germans in their attempt to conduct their reconciliation with the Muslims who are now the other, who has been used and misused. And that has pointed out to be something else which is very interesting.
interesting. It is a review of a book from Prof, by Prof. It is a book that was published recently and is called Conversations with Writers. And it is a series of essays of Prof meetings with various writers. And a certain Günther Onemus writes in the distinguished literary supplement of Die Zeit, and he says, this Onemus says, for the Jew, and he meant Prof, but for the Jew, only when a Jew dies, it is an event of significance. This is the way it is with Jews, not only with Ron, but with Appelfeld as well, especially in Israel. Why in Israel? Because in Israel, they are destroying cemeteries of Muslims in order to build a new Hilton hotel in Tel Aviv. And it is a fact, because a new book that has been recently published in Israel says that when you go by a cemetery of Gentiles, you have to curse. This is the way they do things. It was like that in the Talmud times, and today they do the same thing. And all this is part of a review of a book where there is a discussion described between Prof and Aaron Appelfeld. Now, what does this say? That the ghost from the Talmud is now living, alive and kicking in Israel, cooperating with the Hilton chain, and finding its way into the book of Prof. Well, if this is so, what does one do? Do we have the option of returning into the Jewish community? The question is how to react. Several weeks ago, the book by Amos Elon was published on the wonderful history of German Jews, which is reminding everyone of what was and will never be again. And the beginning of denial, the last 10 days of Hitler, the Empire in Saxony, the literature on the horrors of the communist regime in East Germany, the nostalgia in West Berlin, etc., etc. And against all these threatening streams, there is a community, quite a large community, but the gap in that community between the intellectuals and more than 90% of the community is a gap that cannot be bridged any longer, not in the spirit that prevailed in the past. It is not a gap that can be bridged, and certainly not in one single generation. Most of German Jews today do not speak German. They do not participate in the public debate. The political views are not expressed, and were they to be expressed, they would be very anti-Islamic, they would be almost fundamentalist. They are preoccupied with their own problems, and they also have a lot of inner strife between themselves. The community in Berlin especially does not take into account any longer the Israeli voice, and there's nowhere to go back to. And I remember the last interview given by Ignaz Bubis in 1999, just before he died, and then it seemed almost apocalyptic. And this was even before the Intifada, before what happened with Israel. It was 1999, and he said that he does not feel there at home anymore. And he knew exactly what he was talking about. How much longer do I have? 3 minutes. Okay. I do not wish to start giving you examples of anti-Semitism, clear-cut anti-Semitism, but cases that are interesting not necessarily in the press, but in the expression of a person that I have known, not personally, but I've been corresponding with him. He's very well known, Ludwig Watzel. I don't know if you know him. He's the man. He's always been anti-Israeli, somebody said, but he's just come out of the closet. He was against Israel, or he was critical of Israel, and now he's come out of the closet. He gave an interview to the Deutsche Radio some time ago. In that interview he says, what is the common denominator between Chaim Saban, this mogul from Hollywood, Michel Friedman? You remember him, he and a bunch of people
companies that were bought with money, and Michael Wolfson. What is the common denominator between them? There are three Jews who support Ariel Sharon. And what do they want to achieve? They want to take over German media through cynical and manipulative means. Chaim Saban doesn't care to stand in Dachau and speak on the telephone about selling and buying, and so they want to take over the public debate in Germany. Remember that, Vaxa says, when the next stage comes in the coping with the past in Germany. Remember that then. So, I've been asked, what are we dealing with? Anti-Semitism, anti-Israelism, anti-Sharon, anti-Americanism. What are we talking about? How does one define these things? And I think that I doubt whether these things can be distinguished in a very clear-cut manner. But quite often, the mere fact of using the term anti, it is like a code for another anti, which is like a substratum, beginning with the anti-colonialism and up to the anti-globalism. My friend Christoph Schmidt quoted once from a German philosopher, a modern one who's still alive, whose name is Udo Marquardt, and when relating to the 68th generation, and he says the following: they replaced the non-opposition to the old dictatorship with an opposition to the non-dictatorship of today.
Von Nicht-Widerstand gegen die Diktatur zum Widerstand gegen die Nicht-Diktatur. פעם לא היה להם מצפון.
In the past, they had no conscience, but today they consider themselves as the conscience that should guide anybody else. This is what Udo Marquardt said, and today there is a truth in that, and see how these things go over, not necessarily from right to left, but like Angelika said, when Milliman speaks, when Milliman spoke about the campaign of the 18. You're talking about the campaign of the 18. What is the campaign of the 18? I'm sure the German knows what this refers to. What is this? He said, I want 18%. Why not 19? Why not 15? Why not 25%? Why not 100%? Because those who understand anything about codes, the letter K and the letter 1 and the letter 8, the numerical equivalence to those letters is the equivalent to the name of the Führer. And those who think that Milliman is naive and by mistake, by coincidence use this thing, well, you won't be taken seriously. This is no hazard. That these are the numbers that have been used, the numerical equivalent of A and H, Adolf Hitler. So the question is the following: Who do they represent? In whose name do they speak? Some of them are left, some of them are right-wing. Do they represent the Jewish community? No. And everyone knows that the Jewish community cannot. They do not represent them. So in whose name do they speak? The name of Israel? No, they don't want to do that. They don't want to have an AIPAC. They don't want to be identified as a group at all. So their strength as a group has been weakened very considerably. And my general impression, which will be my conclusion, is one of confusion, of sense of being lost, and in conclusion, one thing should be said. There was no reporting in the German press on this conference in Elbau.
Maybe we'll speak. Thank you, Juju, for that wonderful presentation. Really, stopwatches have become obsession. Well, Sharon has become an obsession. People say, oh, I don't know. Maybe we should change Sharon's name. After David Witzthum, we now move on to Professor Robert Wistrich. As you know, he's head of or director of the Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism. Robert is the Neuberg Scholar for Modern European History at the Hebrew University. He's written many, many books. Obviously, I can't list every single one of them, perhaps just the main ones, which I'm sure you've seen in all sorts of shops. I always envy him because he's in all the important bookshops in London. For example, I start, in fact, at the end. It's a different book that he edited with Nietzsche, Godfather of Fascism, Hitler and the Holocaust, which he wrote on his own in 2001, Anti-Semitism, The Longest Hatred, Pantheon, 92, Socialism and the Jews, Oxford University Press, 82. It's a very long list of important books written by Robert here. What I would like to say is that between 1999 and 2001, Robert was one of the 6 experts appointed to an international committee on Jewish-Catholic relations, investigating Pius VI's actions during the Second World War. He's been involved in a very interesting documentary film called Blaming the Jews, and in November he even addressed the British Parliament, House of Commons, about the dangers of escalation of anti-Semitism in Europe. So I assume that he knows quite a lot about contemporary anti-Semitism in Europe today. And thank you very much, Doron. First of all, I've received instructions to speak slowly. Now the fact is that there's no need to give me an instruction like that because I naturally speak slowly. But the intention is to make it a little easier for the interpreter. So I assume that it'll make things easier for the public as well. We've heard a great deal of, or a great many important things said here, and willy-nilly I'll have to comment on these things now, being the third and last speaker. I'd like to start with a comment that Dudu made with regard to the marked anti-Israeli atmosphere in Europe today and the implications for the Jews themselves. I'd like to dwell somewhat on the substance of this anti-Israeli atmosphere as expressed in Germany itself. But before I go into this issue, I think it's important to note or point out that quite a few of the things I'm about to say also to be found in other countries, particularly in Western Europe. And so when we refer to the German case this evening, I think we must, and it's important that we maintain a sense of proportion and remember that Germany is not exactly the example, the most flagrant example of anti-Semitism in today's European Union. However, at the same time, there really is a German problem, a Jewish problem. Doron has reminded us of this obsession with Sharon. You came across a very unpleasant demonstration in Germany, so did I, not that long ago. But I have a somewhat longer memory, perhaps, than people not involved in history professionally. And I remember as a young student at the end of the 60s when I was for the first time in Berlin, and I came across a left-wing, an extreme left-wing demonstration. Those were the great, quote-unquote, days of the extreme left, and the slogan of these people was Schlag die Zionisten tot und macht die Nahen Osten rot. Wonderful rhyme in Germany. kill the Zionists and make the Middle East red. One of the veterans of the new German left of those days, someone called Horst Mahler. And I think we can take him as something of a symbolic figure insofar as recently he has become the spokesman for and ideologist of the far right. In the 70s, at one point, he was identified with the Rote Armee Fraktion, the most violent group of the Baader-Meinhof left, whereas now he is up there representing the practically neo-Nazi group, the NPD, which in the recent elections did in fact perform quite well. A few years ago, Mahler said something very interesting when he said, did he see a common denominator between his positions 30 years ago and his position as a far-right person today? And he was asked about anti-Americanism and anti-Israelism, and his anti-Semitism certainly cannot be doubted today. And he sees himself as being entirely consistent. And it's important to point out, and this is my first point, which relates to the content and the ideological nature of anti-Semitic positions of today. Certainly there is a drawing closer of the left and the right over Israel and America. In demonstrations, in writings, when reference is made to Bush and Sharon, there's always an addition of Hitler as well. In other words, the Third Reich, the United States of America, and Sharon's Israel. This is the triangle, or should we say the unholy threesome. On the left and on the right as well, particularly in the more radical factions. Today there are conspiracy theories which define the major events that are taking place in the world, particularly after 9/11. You must remember that in Germany as well, but not only, there have been a number of bestsellers written by not insignificant people against the background of these events, of all things. And as a result, it comes as no surprise that the CIA, with the help of the Mossad, sometimes in conjunction with them in a very overt fashion, has undertaken studies of what's going on here. Conspiracy theories were in fact characteristic of the German left during the First Gulf War, not perhaps as much as we feel them today, but there certainly were expressions along these lines. Conspiracy, anti-American conspiracy theories and anti-Israeli ones at the same time. There is a very clear-cut Jewish link to these issues. Those who believe in such theories base themselves on the assumption that the American Jews are an omnipotent force, that the Jews actually control America, and that they certainly control American foreign policy, the Pentagon and so on, the White House, the Congress, the media, the banks. This is out and out anti-Semitism. And against the background of the Middle East conflict, the Jews are increasingly being defined as, Zionist pigs, and the Americans as brutal bully boys and exploiters. Jewish Israelis and the Jewish Americans are equated with worshippers of Mammon. This image of Mammon, which is a very ancient one, is a tradition of left and right-wing anti-Semitism, and this goes throughout 19th century Europe. This negative image is coming back and becoming very popular today. But what's being added to these old stereotypes are new things as well, which relate to everyday Israeli realities, the pictures that TV viewers are getting, first and foremost, Israeli tanks going into the Palestinian cities, the head-on confrontation that is presented just like that, the head-on confrontation between Israeli tanks and stone-throwing Palestinian children, even though that does not exactly reflect the situation of this intifada. This might have been a more accurate picture, perhaps, of the first intifada, but not so much of this one. In my opinion, what's very worrying is the fact that things that once characterized the fringe of the German political system, this was the situation, say, 30 years ago, have really become commonly accepted in the sense that anti-Israelism, and here I'm making a distinction, I'm talking about anti-Israelism now, direct anti-Israelism, that anti-Israelism then is expressed in most parties, and I don't see a great deal of difference here between the centrist parties and the radical right-wing parties or the radical left-wing parties. In fact, I was actually surprised when I checked out papers such as the National Zeitung, which expresses the very radical right-wing and its expressions with regard to Israel's policy. I compared that then with certain articles that you can find in the mainstream German media. And hence I would tend to say that things which once really belong to the fringes of German public opinion have now become far more mainstream and normal in public life and the German media. Of course, I don't in any way intend to claim that all differences have been blurred. As Angelika said here, certainly there are voices, sane voices, particularly in the German establishment, which are making a genuine effort to put a stop to such runaway attitudes. The present-day German establishment is indeed behaving the way we would expect and hope, with a large degree of responsibility. But the drama that's currently taking place, in my eyes, results from the fact that there is an increasingly wide disparity between this position of politicians in the establishment, on the one hand, and the generally accepted populist approach in German public life. Now, let me give you a few examples of slippage of anti-Semitic and anti-Semitic approaches into the grey area of anti-Semitism. And in the essay that I wrote, I specifically tried to give examples from the whole range of German media. I'm going to give you a single example which I think is a very characteristic dovecot from the Spiegel Weekly. It's not an anti-Semitic magazine. Of course, for many, many years, it has combated all the phenomena of Nazi and anti-Semitic sentiments. But I've noted during this Intifada how in one of its most detailed articles on our conflict, it goes back to the image of an Israel based on biblical fanaticism. If you just look at its title, Auge Auge, an eye for an eye, you can see that, and then there's the subtitle, The Biblical War. The article really tries to make a comparison between one of our biblical heroes, Samson, with whom we're all familiar, of course, who is depicted here as the spiritual father of the Muslim suicide bombers. In other words, the idea of the claim here is that he was the first suicide assailant. Well, it's an interesting idea, and one could well try and further analyze this. But in the context of this article, its meaning was not some sort of analogy that could be examined in depth, but rather the intention was to show that all the atrocities carried out, by radical or Muslim fanatics or radical pro-Palestinian radicals, for every single act of that type there is a Jewish example, the precedent, and they're really trying to explain to the reader why this is happening. So there's a tendency of this kind. It hasn't just started today, but there is this tendency to present the State of Israel and the Jewish enterprise, the entire the Zionist enterprise, in the light of something which is very tribal, reactionary, dangerous, violent, lacking in any intelligent basis, and something which is basically putting the entire world at risk. If you remember, the European Union commissioned a poll in which Europeans in 15 countries were asked to reply to the question, what country constitutes the biggest risk to world peace? And Israel was ranked 1. 59% of all Europeans replied that Israel really is the most dangerous country in the world, a dangerous criminal country. 65% of German cities. That result is actually reinforced by other surveys that have been administered since then with regard to Germany itself. This is the image. Only the Dutch, among important countries, were ahead of the Germans. Apparently in Holland today there's new thinking underway, and I assume this will lead to somewhat different results, but no one can really tell. So what this means is that this terribly negative image of Israel obviously impacts on public opinion in all relations, in all matters concerning Israel itself. There's been a reference here to Millerman's electoral campaign. One must remember that this is the first time since World War II that a party that was once considered to be a moderate liberal one, a balancing act, as it were, in the political scene, that particular party has suddenly decided that it wants to turn itself into a populist movement along the lines of Haider's party in Austria. Now, Duda referred to the code 18AH. In other words, they wanted to achieve 18% of all votes. Möllerman, who is no longer with us, Möllerman based himself on a manifestly anti-Semitic approach. He was very closely related to the Arabs, and he was a vehement critic of Israel. But in this electoral campaign, he apparently perceived that there was a kind of change that was taking place in the atmosphere that was allowing him to go for broke this time and to break perhaps the last taboo that in electoral campaigns one does not make overt use of anti-Semitism. Now, you can always come along and claim that reactions to Möllerman actually endorse an optimistic, perhaps a positive interpretation of the situation of the German people, because he actually was censured and condemned. The establishment closed ranks against him. I believe there were political reasons for that as well, that stance. And actually, that party did not win a resounding victory, to put it mildly, but that's not the entire picture. In my view, one cannot ignore the fact that Möllerman did, as he stressed, gain a lot of support, as in the case of Ullmann, as Angelika has reminded us, from regular Germans. Let's call them ordinary Germans. He himself got slightly higher proportion of the votes than his party. He got many supports of many expressions of support by email. I think that the resounding failure of his party can be ascribed to other factors. It's not necessarily a sign that in any future situation such a party or such a movement, perhaps with a less problematic individual heading it than Möllerman, wouldn't be able to use the same motives. And when he attacks Michel Friedman, that's really a very interesting case. You don't have to like Michel Friedman. He really does have a style which not everybody appreciates, to put it mildly. At the time, I don't know if he still has this program. No, it's over. Oh, he wanted to come back to it. Well, he used to be the compere of a TV program where he criticized politicians. He investigated them in such a way that he questioned them in such a way that he was known as the Great Inquisitor. And really, within a very short time, this man, who had very abrasive style, managed to play the role of the impudent, aggressive Jew, the non-patriotic Jew, the outsider who comes from outside, and the whole time he wants to remind the Germans of the Holocaust. He's a supporter of Sharon, and that's the original sin. Once you do that, then once you support Sharon, that's it. You've finished. So Friedman really just provided the goods himself, and then meanwhile he's vanished from sight. But reactions to Friedman were very interesting ones, in this sense that the potential was seen of the latent anti-Semitism which has existed all the time but below the surface. In Walzer's statements also one can see the same thing. I've read not everything but part of the novel Der Tod eines Kritikers, The Death of a Critic, or rather his assassination, his real character assassination of a well-known person in Germany, Marcel Reifenitsky, a Polish Jew, a very dominant figure in German on the German cultural scene, and that was Walser's response to Reifenitsky. But beyond that, what worried quite a few German critics include the editor-in-chief of the Frankfurter Zeitung was the attitude of many people, which really corresponded to the classical view of Jews in the 19th century. People who were Jews as greedy, social perverts, always after money, avaricious, who knew no boundaries, who was really just trying to screw the Germans, and this became a bestseller. It's interesting to see what becomes a bestseller in Germany. Let me give you another example, which is very, very regrettable, which will lead me to a very painful point. Let's take the case of Norman Finkelstein, the American Jew who's a Holocaust survivor, who wrote his terrible book, The Holocaust Industry. In the US, that book just disappeared. There were no echoes, no reverberation. The anti-Semites everywhere said that it was because American Jewry looked after this, but in Germany very quickly this book became a bestseller overnight. Finkelstein became a very popular figure. I remember in Der Spiegel publications I saw a survey that was commissioned by this weekly, and the results were absolutely miserable. Over 80% of Germans agreed with Finkelstein that American Jewry and world Jewry were abusing and exploiting the Holocaust for pecuniary gains and in order to blackmail and poor Germans. And the most worrying thing was the figure about young people, those aged between 23, between 20 and 30. The percentage of those who agreed with Finkelstein was the highest there. Even the Spiegel was absolutely taken aback and horrified by these results. This brings me on to the following point. Because Finkelstein is a Jew, this brings me on to a point, therefore, that cannot be ignored. A really painful point. The role played by Jews and Israelis in German public discourse. I've come across this, as others have also, in many, many cases. One of the most popular people in Germany, for example, is Uri Avneri. Well, in Germany, you know more or less who Uri Avneri is, but he is a cultural hero in Germany. Everything he writes is translated. He's looked on not only as a hero and a top-notch commentator, but he really gets the most amazing coverage. Recently, Uri Avneri, and this is just an example, or I could give you many, many such examples of this type. Well, I just want to... sorry, the comment is being made from elsewhere, which is off mic, and the interpreters cannot hear it, therefore they can't interpret it. So I'd just like to remind you of the most instructive definition of how Uri Avneri gets through to the German consciousness. And this is particularly interesting because it's not necessarily a left-wing thing. Obviously, the left wing will accept Uri Avneri with open arms, but he gave an interview to something called Junge Freiheit, which is an organ of the far right, and he was asked there about the differences and the distinctions that we're so involved with, also exercised about, between anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel. He was asked whether he wasn't nevertheless worried, criticism of Israel and so on, that they were asking him. So he said, no, it's a duty to criticize Israel in the most serious approach, and anyone who opposes that is an anti-Semite. And I thought, of all of the definitions I've run into recently, that's something really, really new. That's a definition that really makes you think. This definition by Uri Avneri. Anyone who opposes criticism, really major criticism of Israel, will be defined as an anti-Semite. Long list of people. Felicia Langer, I heard her with my own ears in Kassel on ZNet, which is the German left body. There are all sorts of Israelis from all sorts of Israeli universities and all sorts of people who don't have a university affiliation. All sorts of people. They use these expressions made by Israelis and diaspora Jews which are anti-Zionist. They use them and exploit them and abuse them. They take advantage of this alibi. They're the alibi for Germans in order to prove we're not anti-Semitic. When we come along with our lethal criticism of Israel, we're just repeating things that are the same things that are said here in Israel, and everyone knows that there is a kernel, a nucleus of the truth in this. But that's not what they mean. I'm not going to settle scores with anyone from an Israeli university who says this now. I'm saying, how is this accepted in, what does it do, what sort of reception does it get in Germany? Because obviously it has implications and ramifications. And naturally this enables quite a few Germans to really define things with a clear conscience, as it were. And my last point now. The two speakers before me have touched upon this issue, but I would nevertheless like to stress it, because it seems to me that this might in the future be a critical topic. We can already see the tendency along these lines, and obviously what I'm referring to is this issue of Germans as victims. Recently, there have been a number of other bestsellers that cannot be ignored, particularly I'm thinking of Georg Friedrich, Deutschland im Bombenkrieg or Brandstätten. These are books that came out in 2002, 2003, talking about the massive bombings by the Allies of German cities. As you know, these cities were absolutely destroyed. There are pictures of burnt corpses, all sorts of atrocities, and the intention is to show the readers that what the Allies did to the German civilian population, what they inflicted on the German civilian population, is something similar. That is a kind of Holocaust. That this is the German Holocaust, the German Shoah. This is their Warsaw Ghetto, and worse than this, Friedrich even refers to Churchill as the biggest murderer of children in history. Apparently he forgot the 1 or 1.5 million Jewish children who were murdered in the Holocaust. But that's a tendency, and this really isn't open, it's a moot point, but it is very worrying. And what is the implication for the long term of outlook, which one can understand from the human point of view, because this matter for many, many years, so many years, was suppressed. But what is the significance when the Germans start to adopt this narrative that they were the biggest victim of World War II? And I fear that this narrative will actually have a critique.
Thank you, Robert, for this presentation that touches on current affairs. We have just a few minutes for questions and answers. We won't delay too much because we've been here for over 2 hours, but what I would like to ask you, please keep your questions brief, not as long commentaries, but rather questions. Let's try. We have to use a microphone. Let's begin with Professor. We had a very bleak picture, quite appalling, but it dealt mostly with the public discourse, with historic bestsellers, which are relevant to that same discourse. Actually, no one referred to the historiography, and only about a decade ago, the focus of discussion was the historiographic approach. I've just returned from Germany, and my partner is still there. And we have witnessed the presentation of a project that had to do with researching public opinion in Nazi Germany by the Nazi authorities themselves. And the picture that we are now discovering is very different from what we thought there was before. Not an indifference or a lack of knowledge, but rather a complete knowledge and pressure from below, from the grassroots. And we are now witnessing, we've been through the whole of Germany, Berlin, Leipzig, Hamburg, other places, but the German historiography, the young German historiography, ages 20, 30, 40, destroyed the myth of the Wehrmacht and brought out in a very significant manner the looting of property, which became a popular consensus. Frank Bayor in Hamburg, murdering the Jews in the everyday life of Eastern Europe. All these research works, which before ended with the expulsion of the Jews to the east, and now they are talking about tens of thousands, even millions, who were murdered by the entire, or by all the segments of population. So the young historiography of the younger generation is different. And now, just a few days ago, I have learned from Susanne Heim, who's one of the co-authors, together with Gertz Ali, those who elaborated the final solution, and she has conducted a very important research of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, this illustrious institute who conducted the experiments in Auschwitz. And last point, she has just told me that Germany nowadays is launching a project of 15 volumes of documentation of the Holocaust, and the partners are the main archive of the Bundesrepublik and Ulrich Brecher, that we are all familiar with as someone who completely changed the trend of historiography in his own institute in Freiburg. So historiography is going into a completely different direction. Task the people of the Hebrew University
to take them to task when they conduct comparisons between Israelis and Nazis and between the Bible and Mein Kampf. And he referred to Uri Avneri, but he did not mention other people. For instance, if he did not mention them, let us not mention them. But that is exactly my question, and it is a brief question. Why? 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 Because I'd just like to explain my question. There is a dispute here between Professor Zimmerman and the head of the Jewish community in Berlin, Alexander Brenner. The rector of the Hebrew University is also involved, and I don't think that we should ignore that. I am Miriam Carmon of the Israeli Deutsche Gesellschaft in Jerusalem. Everything we heard, I unfortunately have to agree with most of the things we've heard, but I do feel I'd like to show something from a slightly different point of view. I work a lot with young people in Germany, with teachers in schools, and I know that they're really doing wonderful work in classrooms where they have plays, and they explain to parents who come and see the plays what the children are studying, and this is definitely not from the Nazi point of view, rather the opposite. There are also tendencies in Germany which are quite strong, and we have to be aware of that, which oppose this neo-Nazi development, and the young people are interested. They come here more than before. We have 24 people this year. Last year we had only 14 young people, and this too is an omen, and we should not only talk about the negative aspects but also about the positive, about the gap between the positions of the politicians and the public at large. And I also started with that when I quoted an official statement and I spoke about the public opinion polls, but I'd like to once again draw the distinction between the politicians, and even between among them there are different people. I'd say when I speak about the government, if I speak for instance of the Chancellor, I can see a tendency of realpolitik, what has to do with Israel, what has to do with the United States, and with the Jewish community as well. As for the foreign minister, I can see more a moral tendency. So this at least is the way I see things. And there are many other politicians, like Roman Melman. They have they hold anti-Semitic ideas, and they have prejudices. Perhaps we should do to all of them what was done to Melman, said the moderator. And there are also people, says Mrs. Timm, there are also people who are indifferent to what is happening here in this part of the world, and all the debates of the intellectuals, they don't care about it really. There are others who have anti-Semitic ideas, who hate foreigners. I found a poll, by the way, which says that about 30-odd% do not want to have Jews as neighbors, but 49% do not want to have Arabs as neighbors. So we should not forget that we have to see what is happening with the other, the approach to the other in general. And what Mariana said, in the general public, there are also other voices which are heard, which oppose these tendencies. And what I wanted to say was that, in my opinion, it is very important that to strengthen these other voices, these other forces, and to oppose the others. Thank you, Angelika. And now do.
Just two brief comments. I must again emphasize the fact that there's a major gap. Robert quite rightly said, not only in Germany but in the whole of Europe, between public opinion, universities, trade unions,
different societies of what's these days, different parts of what's today called civil society, involved with peace, welfare, social justice, overseas affairs, associations which are more and more bringing influence to bear on European politics, and the official establishment in Europe. And I think that gap is only in its infancy. I believe that gap will get greater and greater, and the Jews in Europe are really the victim of this gap. Because in Germany, unlike in France or in England, they are in a community which cannot in any shape or form give them any backing. There's nothing like the French community, where it has the ability to raise intellectual and economic forces. It's a very poor community. Intellectually, it's very poor. It doesn't have an identity, it doesn't have a culture, it doesn't have any links, and therefore, in Germany, the intellectual Jews feel very isolated when the full weight of criticism is focused on them. That's one comment. And another answer to another question. When you talk about Russian Jews, it's very difficult to talk about assimilation. In fact, I would say the opposite. I believe that a large proportion of the Jews aren't Jewish for a start, and the Jews, those who recognize themselves Jews, aren't believing Jews anyway. And I would say that on the whole, people marry within the community, not out-marry. They don't marry out, but I would tend to assume that in a generation or two they will marry out. And then the other thing relative to Israel, their attitude is very strange, practically no contact, as opposed to the French or Swiss or Belgian communities. In Germany, there are fundraising efforts, but they're very, very minor. How can one deal with such things? Well, Europe, again, is in a situation of crisis, the way I see things, with regard to what's happened in Israel in 2000 after the terrorist attacks in the US and the major hostility with regard to Iraq between Europe and the US. Where it will go, I don't know yet where it will go, but I think we're heading for an era which is only just starting, running on its threshold. We can't see the end of the period, but we can see the beginning of a new period, a new era which will be. First of all, I'd like to link two questions. One by Shlomo Shafir with regard to the revival of German, or the awakening German memory, and the second, Dov Kulkos with regard to German historiography. I think there's a certain link between the two. First of all the public opinion polls in Germany for many, many years, with the most amazing degree of consistency, have shown that most of the German public, an overwhelming majority, over two-thirds, want to put an end to the focusing on the Holocaust. That is a constant demand on the part of ordinary Germans. Between that and German historiography, there's no link whatsoever. In other words, historians are doing their job. True, the field or the contribution of German historians in exposing the Holocaust and the new fields that have made major contributions, investigating in depth what happened during the Holocaust. None of that is to be doubted or called into question, but you know full well from your own research, though, about anti-Semitism in Germany in previous eras, that ultimately what tips the balance in a crisis, in certain political situations, is not, unfortunately, what tips the balance is not what historians think, but what that silent majority thinks. If and when it, and it certainly doesn't, wakes up and becomes far more if it has a far more sophisticated and aware leader than Molemman, imagine where it can take the silent majority. Imagine if you go back to the kind of economic crisis in the 20s and the 30s, imagine what it might do to the German collective. Today, what worries me is that I see that basically there is no one Germany. That unification or unity, that unification, I won't say it's failed, but basically there are two peoples there. Two people who are currently unified in a single state. When you read that 25% of West Germans would want the wall to come back, that's amazing. Quite shattering. What does it mean? It means that there is a crisis or there's an acute problem in German national identity. There's nothing new. Every time there have been such problems, the Jewish question arises as a question within the overall German question. And if we want to learn something from the lessons of the past as historians, we must be very cautious at such moments. And this is one of the processes which I believe one of the processes that Germans are currently experiencing. True, there are other tendencies as well. It's not catastrophic. The German situation is nevertheless more stable than in a number of their neighbouring countries. You don't have the violence that you have here and the confrontation that you have in Germany or Belgium at the moment, but there's a major potential here. I would like to stress that there's a major underlying tendency. I used the term ressentiment deliberately in my essay with regard to the Holocaust. It certainly exists in the general public. And my last comment to Jakob Berman with regard to the blacklists. I know you like blacklists. So, no, I'm saying this ironically, you understand me, don't misunderstand me, please. It's not nice, this topic of people being blacklisted. Why did I choose Uri Avneri? Not because I want to discriminate against all sorts of other candidates, but I want to make the point that he's the most instructive and wonderful example of someone who's listened to, who really reverberates in the German general public. He was a regular guest of Der Spiegel, as just one example. I can give you a whole list of academics in Israel. I don't agree with them, and I'm making this point perfectly clearly. I don't think you quite understood that before this evening, but now you know. But I won't use this podium and exploit it or abuse it, because we aren't here to disagree about. We now conclude our evening. We'd like to thank our guests, Angelika Timm, Witzthum and Robert Wistrich. Thank you.